unfortunately, that feed during the middle of that interview falling away from us in the Eastern Cape. But let's continue with the conversation, because the ANC in the Eastern Cape holding its conference to elect new leadership still looks like there'll be two main candidates in that conference, in that contest, as you heard. Oscar Mabuyane, the other, probably Babalo Madikizela. At the same time, earlier this week, Parliament passing a law which makes a small change to the way that city managers and other officials are appointed. These two dynamics sound very separate from each other, but they come together in an important way, because so many of the problems we have in our councils are political problems. When you have a conference and power changes, you can end up with a huge political crisis in that council, even in that province. Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana is Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. Professor, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. Firstly, I mean, no one wants to call this conference in the Eastern Cape. No one wants to predict who's going to win. Are you braver than everybody else, Prof? Who's going to win?
Stephen, I'm not so brave. It's been a very tight race. I think it can go either way. But I'm not sure, though, if we should necessarily celebrate whoever wins. It's a very poor slate of candidates, in my view. You have two leading candidates that pretty much have been accused of all sorts of corruption. There's a report that details massive evidence about them, fraud, pretty much submitting invoices that are incorrect, and some of these monies are monies that were meant for a funeral. So, it's a very poor thing, a lack of quality, especially in a province that is supposed to be a home of legends. So for me, it's a little bit disappointing. So I don't see a cause for celebration. Whoever wins, it's pretty much the same problem.
Does that also mean that whoever wins is not going to have a big impact on what happens in the ANC's national conference? I mean, everyone's going to talk about, will the newly elected leader support President Ramaphosa? There's a much deeper question about what happens beneath him in other leadership positions in the national picture as well.
It's clear in the case of Oscar that he will go with Cyril, because he has been supporting him. As for Madikizela, Madikizela is a businessman, and business people tend to be very practical. He's not entirely ideological. He has been fingered for a lot of impropriety. His coming into prominence surprised me. He doesn't really have a long history in the ANC, having risen up steadily up the ranks. He seems to have shot to prominence suddenly. And oftentimes, when that happens, it obviously means that there is something that catapults him to prominence. And in most cases, that tends to be money, especially because he is a business person. However, I wouldn't necessarily associate him with the RET faction. Also, he has to do his own calculations to figure out who is likely to win, who's likely to come out as president at the ANC conference. So you always want to leave conference with the winner, because that determines your own prospects of being premier, of rising up later on. So he might just support Cyril still. So for me, yes, Oscar is a guarantee supporter for Cyril. As for the other chap, I suspect he might also go for Cyril. He's not entirely a guaranteed supporter of the RET.
So what happens when you have a person who's in power for 2 terms in the ANC? Everybody just supports them, and it's part of the power of incumbency in the end. No one wants to be on the losing side. I mean, it's sort of very simple and slightly disappointing at the same time.
Well, I mean, those are politics of the ANC, Stephen. It's not ideology. There's no sense of vision. Oscar's premiership hasn't done that much for the Eastern Cape. Municipalities have not done well. And so, it's not like he's offering a different vision altogether. As to the other fellow, it's the same thing. I mean, I can't associate him with any particular ideology. So it's all self-serving. If you look at the factions, this fellow Madikizela a while ago was with Lungisa, or was an opponent of Lungisa, but Lungisa today is with the other guys. So they fight yesterday, tomorrow they are together. And it's really all about who has or who can give me the largest numbers so that I win. And their track records, I mean, if you look at their slates, the characters there. If you look, you have a fellow called Mcebisi Ndletyana, who's accused of some fraud totaling around 30 million together with some group of people. His case was struck off the road just recently. Struck off the road, not withdrawn completely, because it was struck off the road due to technicalities. But there's a strong case there. Some of those people who were involved have been killed, 2 of them in mysterious accidents. And this fellow is vying for the secretary of the province. Of course, you have Oscar, you have Madikizela also with their own issues. You have Lungisa, who in PE gained some level of notoriety for using the underworld, right, criminals as part of ANC campaigns. So both slates, Stephen, hence I say there's nothing to celebrate here. It is simply a perfect example of how flawed the ANC is and how much it still has to do to cleanse itself. This is nothing to celebrate.
Sure. We've seen in certain places, Professor, where you have 2 different factions. You can actually end up in some councils with 2 different groups claiming to be in control of a certain area. So, I mean, you've been writing about a situation in Nelson Mandela Bay, for example, where 2 people both said they'd been voted into the position of city manager. We saw this in something very similar in Northwest quite recently. How do these situations happen? It's to do with the way that city managers and senior officials are appointed.
Well, councillors have vested interest in the financial affairs of municipalities, so they always fight over who should be the city manager, because they know if I have my guy in, he will influence the direction of those tenders, and also through the appointment of executive directors, right? So you basically build a team that is doing the bidding for you as a group of councillors. Hence, my proposal in that policy paper published by Mistra is that you must have this process as an independent process outside of council. Because if councillors are involved, you know, city managers, even in their own performance, they have to make sure that they placate these councillors. But if you have an independent process, that person is then injected to an outside party, they are reviewed by an outside party. So they are likely to do their job a lot better and a lot more efficiently if this thing is done outside of council.
How would we sort of, you know, create a better system? I mean, there was a small change in the Municipal Systems Amendment Act this week. I don't think anyone expects it to, you know, fix these problems. This inherently sounds like a political problem, and that's a function of a broken politics.
Well, I haven't even noticed that slide share, Stephen, I'm afraid. But politics, you see, here's the thing. Politics relies on a particular set of values. You trust that those who are leaders are committed to certain noble values. They are committed to the improvement of the public good. So you allow for politics. And politics is a good thing. Political leaders are inspiring. They lead society out of quagmire. You can think of Nelson Mandela and a whole lot of others. And those were political leaders. So politics in and of itself is not bad. The disappointing part is when these politicians no longer aspire for any noble ideas. They are only concerned about themselves. When that happens, then you can no longer leave your fate on the shoulders of politicians. You need to deal with the institutions so that you are able to get the desired outcome. And so to say leave it to politicians is really to wish for something that might not come. It's a pipe dream. I mean, look at the ANC now. You've been talking of bad governance in municipalities for years, and it continues to happen. So you can't look there anymore. You need to ask, where are you likely to make the most impact? And for me, that is in the institutions. That is why I propose that you change the appointment system. You limit the extent to which impropriety, it might not wipe it off completely, but you limit chances of that happening.
Professor, thank you very much indeed for your time. Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana, professor in the politics department at the University of Johannesburg. Well,